for all the panelists. I've been asked to talk about U.S.-Iran relations. Obviously, Iran's relations with the U.S. are at a low ebb, at least I think they are, and there's not a lot of hope for improvement, I think, in the near term. Iran's problems to the United States, I think, are rooted in diametrically opposed strategic and political agendas that makes them difficult to address and, frankly, harder to solve. There's a lot we can discuss on the topic, and there's a lot going on just this month, if you haven't noticed. So I won't try covering everything, but I'll just briefly discuss a few issues that I think will remain a challenge for at least the next few years, if not much longer. So let's start with sanctions, right? The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign is, of course, the major obstacle for Iran currently, with US sanctions being the top concern. Iran has workarounds that allow it to reduce the full weight of sanctions, but sanctions are still taking a serious toll. The inability to sell Iranian oil and gas widely on the international market alone undercuts Iran's chief economic driver. And there are also numerous other economic and social problems that stem from sanctions. That said, Iran obviously believes it can weather the storm. The Trump administration has sought new talks and a new deal with Iran, at least at times, but the supreme leader has forbid any further diplomatic engagement. Iran has ceded, or hasn't ceded, frankly, an inch on the Trump administration's chief demands and has acted aggressively at times to claw back some leverage with Washington and its allies. Yet Iran still has to face, I think, a really stark realization, and that's that sanctions are really easy for the U.S. to keep up. The U.S. can basically keep these things up indefinitely. They cost very little politically to the United States. And Iran doesn't have that much leverage, but comparatively, they're very destructive to Iran. Related to this is the nuclear deal, which will also remain an enduring challenge. The original nuclear deal, or JCPOA, partly solved the dispute temporarily Iran's nuclear enrichment program. But when the US pulled out of the deal, Iran's nuclear program became a problem again. Even though Iran has chosen to maintain most of the deal, it has shown a willingness to restart problematic aspects of it and continues to flirt with advancing its enrichment beyond imposed limits. All of that makes the United States and Europe nervous, as well as regional allies of both. Iran's position hasn't paid off. While Europe has in some respects been sympathetic to Iran's grievances, sympathy doesn't pay the bills, right? And the Trump administration hasn't budged on its position. Iran might be banking on a change in the upcoming US election, but there's no promise that a Biden administration would simply just reinstate the old JCPOA as was, regardless of whether Biden, supported it to begin with. Nor is it clear that Iran would even agree to that agreement anymore. They may want to claw back more concessions from the United States. And Iran's also going to have its own presidential election next year, and domestic politics, I think at least, will play a bigger role in its foreign relations, particularly leading up to and following whoever's elected. And how much Rouhani will be empowered to do in his last year, I think, is anyone's guess, but he'll be a lame duck president. He's not terribly empowered right now, nor has he been for most of this last term. So I doubt he'll be very effectual, for his last year. This leads us all to the question of, potential for escalation. Iran has to deal with the Trump administration's willingness to use force. And while Washington has been generally, I think, hesitant to escalate, the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force chief, was a display of intent that Iran has not seen from the United States, I think, frankly, since the 1980s during the Tanker War. Even at the peak of Iran's support to militias during the U.S. occupation of Iraq, for example, a decade ago or even 15 years ago, the U.S. wasn't killing Quds Force operatives. They were arresting them, but they weren't killing them. That made the killing of Soleimani, I think, a giant break with past precedent, and a real departure from the status quo that's been built up over decades. No matter how much Iran might dismiss American resolve, and they do this all the time in official statements and propaganda, it's got to take into consideration that this administration is not to use force, at least whenever it wants to. Force hasn't made Iran demur, however. I mean, I think, in fact, it's had the opposite effect. Iran has acted aggressively in response to aggression. But for Iran, using military power against the United States is a mixed bag. You know, for example, if we look at the ballistic missile strikes on Ain al-Assad base in Iraq, Iran was able to display willingness to escalate and showcased its capabilities. But it also kind of betrayed, I think, its limitations, right? Iran has very few tools in which to engage and manage U.S. pressure. Without strong diplomacy, military force can only get you so far. That's especially true for Iran, but it's also true for the United States, as we well know from the 21st century. Finally, I think it's worth to say a few words on Iraq. Within the region, I think Iraq is really the most important kind of overlapping concern for the United States and Iran. But they have conflicting interests, right? And those conflicting interests are, I think, the most likely spark for any type of potential escalation or hostilities. Since Soleimani's death, Iran and its clients, the Shia militias in Iraq and others, have pushed hard to get U.S. forces expelled from the country. And while sort of in the immediate sort of backlash to the killing of Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, his Iraqi counterpart, they've made some traction, right? But they haven't been successful ultimately, at least not yet. The current Iraqi government under Prime Minister Kazemi appears to still value the U.S. presence. He also appears to be pushing for more independence from Tehran. But despite this, Iranian proxies continue to lob rockets into Baghdad's green zone and at bases housing troops. They also struck a convoy not staffed by U.S. soldiers, but it still had U.S. equipment. Just this last week, these attacks are all likely, intended to goad the U.S. into responding in kind, right? They want the U.S. to strike again, so they can have that political ammunition, get people on the street, make it a cause célèbre again, in order to sort of push Iran out. But every sort of rocket that falls on the green zone and the U.S. doesn't respond, again, betrays sort of the limitations that Iran and its clients have, both politically and strategically, to sort of get what they want in Iraq. And engage in that kind of behavior, I think, is a really risky adventure and can easily backfire for Iran and its allies. It can lead to escalation, it can lead to further hostilities, but also because Prime Minister Kazemi is not a clear ally of Iran and has shown a willingness to go after pro-Iran militias when they cross the line, i.e., launch rockets. The more that they sort of conduct violence in Iraq, the more that they engage in that kind of behavior, sort of going against Iraq's own laws and its own sort of attempts at stabilizing the country, I think Iran, frankly, risks its own footing in the country. I think Iran's influence has declined over the last 6 months. I don't necessarily think that's a permanent thing. Iran and Iraq will have, I think, much closer relations than Iran and the United States, at least sort of in terms of economic and social and cultural, as well as political. But for all of Iran's efforts and for all of the efforts of its clients within the country, they're still no closer to kicking out U.S. troops than they were, 6 months ago when they were riding the wave of Soleimani's assassination. So I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and I want to leave plenty of time for the other panelists. So I think I'll just wrap up here. These issues are really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to U.S. and Iran relations. There's a million things I haven't mentioned, Israel for one. But I think these are issues that, regardless of whether Trump is reelected or we have Biden in the White House, and regardless of whether a hardliner is elected in Iran in next summer, or we have some sort of Rouhani-like pragmatist running the government, I don't think it matters. Governments on both sides are going to have to deal with these issues, and I think these issues will be at the fore of U.S.-Iranian interactions, for at least the next few years, if not longer. So I'll go ahead and leave it there, and happy to discuss whatever else when it comes to it.
Thank you, Afshan. And Ariane, over to you. You should be able to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for having me, and Raleigh and FPRI. It's always a pleasure to partake in your events. I'm going to pick up essentially where Afshan left off, and speaking of things that will be challenging regardless of who is elected here or in Iran. One thing that the United States has to consider and will continue to sort of grapple with is this balancing strategy that Iran has developed, I would say not even just over the past few decades, but over the course of centuries. And we're seeing that manifest itself pretty clearly today in the context of the Iran-China deal that was announced, that is making the rounds in the media, but also in the context of Iran's relationship with Europe. So I want to zoom out a little bit and talk a bit about how Iran engages in this balancing and why it's all relevant. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we should anticipate next, kind of breaking it down along long-term, medium to short-term things that we should be anticipating and we should be thinking about. So first of all, I want to kind of go back to the decade prior to the JCPOA very quickly to talk a little bit about the environment that created that led Iran to return to the negotiating table and to strike the nuclear deal exactly 5 years ago today. In the decade prior to the JCPOA, Iran was increasingly isolated by the United States, leading their international community. A number of sanctions were imposed on Iran. At the time, it was the harshest sanctions on the country yet. And that led Iran, in part, to kind of start to tilt toward both Russia and China. So over the course of the late 2000s and early 2010s, you start to see Russia and China both gaining a lot of influence within Iran and at times actually butting heads against each other for influence in the country. Iran, for its part, was trying to balance those two countries off of each other after having turned to them to balance Europe and the United States and to make sure that it overcame the isolation that the United States and its European partners, European allies, were trying to impose on Iran. But then what becomes tricky, and again, this is worth considering, especially in the context of this Iran-China deal, is that as China and Russia, but we'll come back to that, begin to gain more ground within Iran, you also have a lot of grievances within the country that start to form, right? From the elite's perspective, China was not a very reliable partner, neither was Russia really. They didn't really deliver projects on time. They were kind of wishy-washy. They always had to balance their own interests with regard to the United States and their interests with Iran. And from the population's perspective, one thing you would often hear when we're doing field work for the book that you mentioned, Aaron, we heard this a lot. People were saying, there is a lot of Chinese junk coming to the market, and we don't really want that. We want products that come from Europe that are higher quality. And so there was this sort of sense of grievance and resentment that was forming. So that was part of the reason why Iran decided to return to the negotiating table in 2012. It wasn't necessarily because Iran was under the impression that it was going to be forming a new alliance with the United States, or it was going to even be able to normalize relations with the United States. It wasn't even something that, as Afshan was saying earlier, is not something that many Iranian leaders necessarily want. Khamenei and others have pretty consistently opposed any kind of normalization or bettering of the relationship between the U.S. and Iran. So their main objective was really to be able to form a better relationship with Europe, particularly when it came to business and trade and the economy. So when the JCPOA is signed, again, 5 years ago today, a lot of Iranians welcomed it because they saw it as a new era for the country, turning away from China, turning away from Russia, and being able to kind of once again have trade and engagement with Europe. Of course, things become a lot more challenging already with the implementation of the JCPOA in 2016, but especially starting in 2018 when President Trump withdraws from the deal. What the Iranians were initially hoping was that Europe would at least be able to offset some of the costs of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. And that was actually quite clear in the statements that were made right after President Trump's announcement on May the 8th that he was withdrawing the US from the deal. Khamenei actually, I think in his first Friday prayer speech, said something to the effect of, listen, we need to prepare the groundwork for resuming nuclear activities if we need to, but in the meanwhile, let's continue to engage the Europeans and see if they can kind of help us overcome the challenge that is presented to us because of the US withdrawal. After a year of what they dubbed strategic patience, the Iranians really, I think, started to realize that Europe was essentially paralyzed, right? Europe was stuck between the US and Iran. As Afshan, I think, said quite accurately, you know, they had a lot of sympathy for what Iran was going through. They did blame the United States for leaving the JCPOA and starting this sort of new era of tension. The Europeans had thought that at least the nuclear issue was dealt with and they could turn to other things. But sympathy, you know, didn't pay the bills, right? So effectively, you didn't see any money coming in, any business coming into Iran. And that made it a lot more challenging for Iran to kind of sit on its hands. And so you saw the kind of change in the way Iran was interacting, not just with the United States, but also with Europe. So when Iran was targeting tankers in the Persian Gulf and in the Strait of Hormuz, it wasn't just targeting American interests, it was also targeting British tankers, for example. And so the Europeans were dragged into the tension between the US and Iran, and that was by design. That was part of Iran's strategy, not just to impose a cost on the US, but also to make sure that its allies in Europe understood that if things were going to go the way they were going, that they would be affected as well. European interests would also be at stake, not just Iranian interests. So with that, this brings me to today and sort of, you know, what is next for Iran relations with Europe, but also with China. And I would say, broadly speaking, one thing that is important to realize is that today Europe is not the same Europe, at the risk of stating the obvious, as when the JCPOA was reached, right? You have had Brexit. You no longer have that unity. And there was already, you know, there were tensions between European parties, including the E3. So France, the UK, and Germany had different views on different parts of the JCPOA and engagement with Iran. But I think that's especially true today, where the UK especially is kind of increasingly turning toward the United States versus France and Germany. So, you know, Europe is not monolithic, but Iran understands that and tries to leverage that. But nevertheless, there is, I think, some trends that we can point to, again, in the short, medium, and long term, and I want to break those down a little bit. So the short term, I'm defining as between now and January 2021, which is when we will either have a new president in office or we will know that President Trump is sticking around for another 4 years. That is the time frame that Iranians, I think, have sort of have started to kind of think about in terms of the JCPOA's survival. One of the reasons why they haven't done too much to rock the boat, despite being disappointed with Europe, is that they are trying to see what happens with the elections here in November and whether or not, you know, they have to continue working with the assumption that President Trump's maximum pressure campaign will be in place, or whether a Biden administration would, and, you know, Afshan raises a good question about whether or not he would even be able to return to the JCPOA or what form that would take. But nonetheless, he has indicated that he would be willing to return to the JCPOA if Iran does, whatever form that would take. There would be some form of engagement that you know, that he would try to kind of undertake. So I think the Iranians are kind of trying to wait out the Trump administration if it's possible. And I see the announcement of the Iran-China deal actually as part of this campaign. The Iranians are desperately needing some sort of boost domestically because things are getting tricky for the Rouhani government, for the system more generally. There's a lot of discontent within the country, as Afshan has mentioned. And so I think they're kind of trying to show that, you know, with this Iran-China deal, they're not isolated. They can hold off a little bit more. And either way, there's this economic lifeline that is going to come their way, even though, you know, we don't actually know that much about the deal, right? And we can come back to that in Q&A, but we don't really know what it concretely covers. There's a lot of big promises, as China tends to make, and very little in terms of actual detail and actual projects that would be completed. But I think in the meanwhile, the Iranians understand that they shouldn't expect too much in the next few months from Europe, because the Europeans are perpetually stuck, again, trying to balance the US and Iran. And we see that in the latest tensions around the arms embargo, which we can also come back to. In the medium term, if Biden is elected, I think that there would be a role for Europe in terms of helping lubricate the relationship between the two countries. Biden has made it clear, his advisors have made it clear that the transatlantic relationship, the transatlantic alliance is going to be one of the key things that they're going to try to restore. But I think it is pretty clear to both parties that once negotiations resume, it is actually going to be between the US and Iran, that Europe will be effectively sidelined because at the end of the day, and I think this is the biggest lesson from the JCPOA for Iran, what matters is what happens with US secondary sanctions, and absent some serious sanctions relief and real kind of forthcoming efforts by the US administration to encourage businesses to go into Iran, that is going to be pretty tricky, and the Europeans are not going to kind of try to do that. If President Trump is reelected, we might see some kind of movement as we saw in April, May 2018, when the French and the Germans and the British as well were trying to get President Trump not to withdraw from the deal, but to instead keep it and build on it. We might see something like that again take place. But again, I think that, and this has been pretty clear from at least what we've seen with the way President Trump has handled negotiations in the past with North Korea, for example, it is very much going to be a bilateral engagement, not so much with involving other allies and partners. He's been pretty skeptical of allies and partners in general anyway. And finally, in the long term, I want to kind of go full circle to where I started, which is that, Iran's relationships with various countries have been kind of cyclical, right? You've had this sort of balancing of Russia and China against Europe, then you had Russia and China against each other, and now you're kind of going back to a place where you have the Iranians trying to balance China against the US, against Europe. And so this is something that, we will continue to see for the foreseeable future. And that we shouldn't expect to change because of one comprehensive deal with the Chinese, or because of potentially a JCPOA 2.0 under either this administration or a different one. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ariane, and we'll turn it over to Alex for his comments. And just a note before you start, Alex, to the three speakers, we have made you co-host, so you can unmute yourself once we turn it over to questions and answers.
Okay, I'm very pleased to attend also. Thank you, everybody. First of all, I want to apologize for my awful hard Russian accent. I cannot get rid of it, and even I can hide it. So try to understand me. Okay, Russia and Iran. I think, of course, they are not allies. Of course, they are not friends at all, but there are a kind of situational partners, almost independent of each other, independent players in world politics, whose interests suddenly, temporarily coincide. Of course, there are a lot of interesting details in this relationship. Maybe you can remember how journalists in Iran, Iranian journalists, claimed several times that Russian President Vladimir Putin also several times called Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the head of Al-Quds, who was killed in New Year, my friend Qasem. He visited Putin. He visited him several times since 2015 in Moscow and in his residence on Black Sea in Sochi. Yes, and there is some evidence that it was Soleimani who pushed Putin, who pushed the Kremlin to begin a military operation in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad. Of course, I think the real architects of all Russian operations, military operations in Syria, of course, they are sitting in Moscow, not in Tehran. But if Soleimani was generally the main coordinator of all Iranian military operations abroad. Of course, Russia should have coordinated its military actions in Syria, of course, directly with him. In general, Moscow and Tehran, there are antipode regimes, but there are a lot of very interesting similarities. For example, for many years, the Iranian government, like the Russian government, has diverted the attention of Iranian people from internal pressing, distracted by external problems. All economic troubles, for example, were explained by some hostile actions and sanctions from the West, etc., etc. This is a very big similarity. As in Russia, the entire Iranian economic system is structured so in such a way that the state dominates the entire private sector, and the role of this private sector is very, very suppressed. Yes, as we say in Russia, for example, we don't have the private sector; we have a semi-state sector. Yes, that means it's practically impossible to run any business in Russia or in Iran, for example, now without some connection with some local particular power group. If you start interacting with any large and maybe formerly completely private company, I know this from my friends, from some Russian businessmen who are dealing with some Iranian partners. Then, when you are coming to the end, you could realize that one way or another is connected and is associated with maybe the clergy, with priests, yes, or with Islamic guards, or with one of the power clans that exist in the country, yes. And there is a big similarity in this. Of course, in the last 30-35 years, one of the cornerstones of the ideology of modern Islamic Iran has been the kind of maybe representation of their country as the besieged fortress. And there is also a big similarity. And writing of a number of internal problems to the fact that Iran is in the circle of enemies, like Russia, yes, like Putin saying all the time. This so-called sinister hand of the West, some manipulations, and Moscow and Tehran, they saw it in almost, for example, all the speeches, all the articles, for example, from RFE, RL, against the Putin regime and maybe against the Rouhani, yes. Also, I mentioned very strange fact, and my experts whom I'm asking to write my articles about Iran, about Middle East policies, they're saying that there is some sudden strange surge, splash of romantic nostalgia for the times of the old monarchical Iran, yes, and some kind of desire from young Iranians to ennoble the reign of the Shah dynasty of Pahlavi. Seemingly, this is gone into oblivion like Romanov monarchy in Russia. But after all, there are similar slogans from the kind of let's take it all back, let's make Iran, in Russia, let's make Russian Empire great again. Yes, they sounded also on the streets of Iranian cities during the this recent protest in 2017, 2019, last year. Yes, it's very similar to Russia, with its also strange nostalgia for the times of the Soviet Union, especially among young people, which didn't see USSR at all. Yes, the same effect is it's some kind of denial of current realities, current problems. It is some kind of attempt to find, I don't know, salvation in the past. Yes, but what I have to say that beside all the similarities, there are also very, very big differences and rivalry between Iran and Russia. First, I think there is a, I'm not a very hard specialist on Iran, but I think there is still a memory of the fact that for about maybe 150 years, until 1979, Iran was some kind of bargaining chip, like in the poker, yeah, chip, bargaining chip maybe, in this big game, yes, between Russian and British empires. And after, then in between the USSR and Great Britain and USSR and the United States. And that's why Tehran, like Moscow rulers, yes, they see behind each expressed non-standard opinion, not hostile, but non-standard opinion, some influence from the outside, some attempt at to interference. Moreover, there is a very strange fact that I know that protesters on the streets in Iran, I know, for example, they were accusing Moscow and the Russian authorities of helping the regime to suppress the uprising in 2009. Yes. Also, I remember that in, I don't remember the exact date, but it was May 2019. Moscow decided that it would not supply air defense system, anti-aircraft, is S-400 famous, yes, to Iran. It's interesting that Putin is ready to deliver these systems to Turkey, and they already sent there, but not to Iran. Moscow refused to supply these systems to the Iranians, in making it clear that it doesn't want to escalate the situation in the region and doesn't want an additional clash with the United States. I think Moscow and Russia, Putin he uses Iran, and Iran plays, of course, a really significant role for Russia. Firstly, of course, directly in Syria, where Tehran is helping Russia to guarantee Assad's military power, military superiority over the opposition. Yes, because I think Putin has no illusions. The Russian, the Syrian government, the official Assad's army achieved its recent current success only because the military capabilities of Assad's regime were backed up not only by Russia but also by Iran. Yes, Putin, Russian military, Russian airplanes alone, they are not able to guarantee the preservation of the military potential of the Damascus. Yes, but in Syria, Iran is increasingly contrary to Russia. Moscow and Tehran dream, I think, of keeping Bashar al-Assad in power. In both cases, they have their own reasons. But I think Putin is blind when he doesn't see the dangers of so-called Shiite Christian. Yes, if some kind of split arises between Moscow and Tehran, we will see, I think, complications in regional policy issues where Moscow would like to succeed. For example, the regulation of the legal status of the Caspian Sea, or some, I don't know, area of global energy cooperation, or some military and political problems and situation in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, in South Caucasus, and even in Russian Northern Caucasus. Yes, the main idea of Moscow policy towards Iran, yes, is against whom we are friends, if not for common hostility, sorry, with the United States. Moscow and Tehran could have long been enemies. The Kremlin, I think, Putin, believes that Iran is, I don't know how to say, is some kind of stick that is inserted into the wheel of American policy. That Iran impeds the United States very much, and by supporting the regime of the Ayatollah, Washington's position could be influenced. Iran remains, from this point of view, a very important tool of the entire Russian foreign policy. And that's why Moscow and Iran will remain forced strategic partners, primarily in Syria, despite their growing rivalry in the world, oil market, and other events that have recently led to an increase in, I know, mutual tensions in Russian-Iranian relations. The main factor that is cementing this alliance doesn't change. This dislike of the United States shared by the leaders of both countries. But there is another factor that I know that authorities in Tehran, they believe that Russia, by increasing their oil production, strikes Iran somehow. Also, they know that any global conflict, especially any possible conflict between Iran and the United States, is very beneficial for the Kremlin and for the Putin. Because firstly, oil prices, and in this case, they are rising. Of course, in addition, Iran is being squeezed out of the market, and there are other reasons. And Syria, again, is also the cementing factor of so-called Russian-Iranian friendship. But now it's obvious that Iran looks at Syria, in fact, as its own colony. Yes, for Tehran, I think this is not just some kind of a temporary adventure, but Syria for Iran is a base that they intend to develop, and I'm sure that sooner or later Tehran will start some conflicts there with Russia, with Moscow, which because their interest in Syria, of course, contradict each other, and at the same time, there is a very big concern of Putin, of Moscow. They are watching with alarm, some maybe fear, with great concern of what is happening in Iran. I mean, the recent protests, because I think in the recent years, Kremlin has developed a certain kind of paranoia when it comes to any anti-government protests in countries considered allies in this Putin struggle against the West. It could be Venezuela, or I don't know, Hong Kong, Sudan, or Bolivia, where in some cases all the rulers were successfully overthrown. Yes, sorry, everywhere in Moscow they see so evil influence from without. Yes, as they say, since the time of the Soviet Union. Yes, it's a very famous saying, the bloody hand of the CIA. Yes, it's funny, but it's so. And any revolution against any authoritarian regime, and even more so allied to Russia, it's a very disadvantageous for Moscow, because from the Putin's point of view, this could have some negative impact on its own Russian population. Yes, so Tehran for Moscow, I would say, I'm just finishing. Yes, it's a Moscow loves Tehran because it's a kind of eternal stone in the shoe, in the boot of Washington, and in different times, but it's the same.
Thank you very much for those remarks. And I've been collecting some questions coming in, so I want to remind everybody that if you do have some questions, please make sure to utilize the chat function. And we have about half an hour for open discussion here, because one rule is I finish my events on time. And there's two sort of broad themes, and I think maybe they're directed more at Ariane and Afshan. But Alex, Alexander, if you have input as well, please feel free. And it's sort of like looking at the outcome of the maximum pressure strategy. So, the Trump administration is coming to the end of, what may be its only term, or maybe the start or the end of the first term in leading into the second term. And so if we're looking at sort of the effect of the sanctions and the maximum pressure policy, has it worked? Is, Iran on the brink of collapsing into chaos, or their leaders, under so much strain that they could be convinced to lash out and quote unquote go to war? And I think within that, maybe a discussion a little bit about how, maybe the recent events that we've been seeing in Iran, these explosions that are going off, and not asking you how those explosions are happening, but maybe how they're playing out, at least in the discourse in Iranian society. So I don't know, Afshan or Ariane, if you want to take that first, but just let me know who wants, and just jump right in.
Are we both being quiet?
Yeah, Ariane, go ahead.
Ariane, you go first, and then, if I have anything to add, I'll go ahead. And...
Okay, that sounds good. So, I think to answer the question, first of all, we have to sort of think about what the objectives are. And depending on who you ask in the Trump administration, you would have different answers about what the ideal outcome of the maximum pressure strategy would be. The president himself has been pretty clear that he would like negotiations to get a better deal from Iran. And that clearly hasn't happened. Other parts of the administration, Secretary Pompeo, for example, hasn't been as clear about wanting negotiations to get to a point where Iran changes its behavior, but has certainly, laid out the 12 famous points where he's said, we want these different areas of Iran's foreign policy to change. And I think there you have kind of mixed results. There's some tactical successes potentially on Iran's regional activities, for example, right? If we take some recent reporting and the administration's own metrics, which we can't verify in the open source at face value, then Iran may be dialing down some of its support for non-state actors, though, and I'll let Afshan talk about his piece more, but as Afshan has written, the broader strategic shift is going to be very complicated, if not impossible, under current circumstances, because Iran sees these actors as part of its grand strategy. So we haven't seen a complete change in Iran's foreign policy in the region, but we may have seen some tactical shifts here and there. And that might be valuable enough by itself. And perhaps if Trump gets another term, he'll be able to do more there. But I think more broadly and more strategically, we haven't seen too much change, right? The regime is obviously suffering economically. There is clearly a lot of discontent at home. We've seen it with the protests erupting over the past few years. And clearly a regime that has to crack down, and with the severity that it did in November, is not feeling particularly secure in its legitimacy among the population. So it's hurting, but is it leading to it changing things like its nuclear program, its missile program? There, I don't think we've seen a lot of strategic change. And in fact, I would argue that the maximum pressure campaign has backfired on Iran's nuclear program, right? Where the breakout time, at the time the JCPOA was implemented, when Trump took office, was more than a year, and now, depending on whose calculation you take, it's just a few months, and shrinking quite rapidly as Iran continues its activities. So I would say it's a mixed bag, but generally speaking, in terms of the broader strategic impact, I think it's still fairly limited.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. I agree with all of them. I think one of the ways to look at the maximum pressure campaign, I think, is using the Trump administration's own words to describe it, right? And they often describe it as aimed at reducing Iranian aggression, assertiveness, meddling in foreign countries, and this kind of stuff. And if we take that as the metric, then I think it hasn't done anything really at all. But I'm not entirely convinced that that's actually sort of what the Trump administration is actually going for. I mean, I think ideally, yes, that's what the 12 points are trying to sort of get at. But I think, if we look at what the maximum pressure campaign actually is, it really is just a sanctions regime, or at least mostly, and in this sense, it's mostly punitive. It's meant to sort of discourage Iran's behavior by basically, making them go bankrupt in one way or another, by squeezing sort of their economy to such an extent that they would choose to sort of the guns over butter kind of thing. They would choose food over sort of funding military power. But as we've seen, in other countries, let's say, Cuba or North Korea, countries will hold on to sort of their goals, their beliefs, their agendas, their aspirations, whatever, pretty hard. And sometimes even harder, in the face of things like maximum pressure or sanctions or whatever. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag. It's really difficult to know how much Iran's sort of economic challenges have kind of trickled down to the ground level of Hezbollah or Kataba Hezbollah or any of the Shia militias in Iraq or Yemen. It doesn't really seem to have impacted them. I mean, we've all read things about Hezbollah sort of reducing salaries here and there, cutting benefits, for their fighters. And so, maybe people have had to tighten their belts. But at the strategic level, I don't think it's really changed all that much. And if anything, Iran has sort of redoubled its efforts, both in Iraq and in Syria, as well as in the Gulf and with Yemen, to sort of, make sure that the gains that it has, it retains, if not sort of get greater gains. This all makes sense. Iran's sort of approach to dealing with sanctions all makes sense from a particular perspective for the first 4 years of the Trump administration, right? Because they can certainly outlast it for the first 4 years. If this continues for another 4 years, I think it's going to have a greater effect. And I don't know to what degree, but I think it really will start to sort of, chip away at Iran's ability to fund some of its foreign programs. I agree with Ariane completely that it doesn't look like sort of domestically like it's having sort of the regime change effect. Let's say that's sort of what they're going for. Iranians, as much as they seem to be sort of willing to protest over certain issues, the Iranian security forces have no problem using excessive violence against them. I mean, as we saw in 2019, they used full military power, particularly in Khuzestan, to put down protests. So they're not about to let a revolution sort of happen sort of without a big fight. So I don't think it's really sort of a reasonable thing to expect this campaign to produce. I think the challenge always for Iran is that it could so easily change its predicament with the United States, if it just backed away from one or two things, like Hezbollah and Hamas, in particular. If Iran backed away from those things and sort of chilled out on Israel and sort of, let's say, took a Saudi position, a 10 years ago Saudi position or 15 years ago Saudi position, I think that would be well enough to satisfy a Democratic administration. I don't know about a Republican administration, but it would go a long ways into sort of settling sort of the 12 demands that Pompeo had. I mean, I think of those 12 demands, I think 6 or 7, if I can remember off the top of my head, related at least directly or indirectly to Israel. It's an issue that Iran could compromise on if it wanted to sort of have its cake and eat it too in the rest of the region. But it doesn't want to do that. I mean, Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, they're all very important in terms of grand strategy, in terms of sort of regime legitimacy, not to the Iranian people, but to themselves, and I think we often sort of, conflate this idea that the regime is somehow, beholden to the Iranian people in terms of its foreign policy. And I see Iranian foreign policy for the most part, with the exception of what Ariane was talking about earlier with engaging Europe, I see Iranian foreign policy for the most part disconnected from really sort of, domestic popular concerns. The concerns are with sort of, the ruling apparatus and with sort of the various sort of influencers within the regime. They're the ones that ideology or politics or whatever matters a lot more. So yeah, I think it's a big mixed bag. I think it's made Iran poorer. I think Iran has fewer resources. I think it's put Iran under stress. If that was a goal, then it's, succeeded in part, but it certainly hasn't succeeded in any way in changing Iran's behavior, I don't think.
Well, let me ask, take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question of all three of you. So, first maybe to Ariane and Afshan, and then I'll come to Alexander. I think one of the things with the Obama administration is that at that time we could effectively put Iran in a box, and what I mean by that is that you could deal with a problem that could be dealt with through a technical agreement, which is what the nuclear deal was. Iran had reached a point in its nuclear development as to where, depending how you judge your metric, it was within, I hate using breakout time, but it was within like 6 months or a year. I can't exactly remember when. It's a silly metric, but we'll use it. But like within 6 months or 2 years to being able to produce enough fissile material that if then you did a whole bunch of other stuff, you could make a nuclear weapon with, right? But in order to monitor that, you could put in place very technical things that the US is particularly good at because of our legacy of arms control with the Soviet Union and the Russians that followed thereafter. And so you could put in place an inspection regime that can more or less guarantee that Iran could not secretly build a nuclear weapon from all the sites that we knew about, which we presumed were all of them, or at least 99% of them. Now with the withdrawal from the JCPOA, now here's the question. Is that no longer possible? Is it no longer just to deal with the technical stuff because we have to deal with all the other stuff, which is, support for militias, agreements about Iraq, ballistic missiles, all those things. And does that cede leverage to Iran because they have always kind of, to deflect pressure, said, we want to have a regional dialogue about security with the United States, not just focus on technical. So that's the question to both Afshan and Ariane. And then perhaps maybe this will be how we wrap up. Alexander, how do the Russians view it if there is no wedge issue with the United States? Like how would that, affect their foreign policy in terms of, trying to blunt, as you said, influence of the United States and perhaps the West more broadly in the Middle East and its near abroad? So I'll start there, and perhaps we'll wrap up with that sort of long-winded questions.
Yeah, I can start. Well, I mean, I think there is actually there are questions about whether the premise of your question is right? That in 2012 to 2015, we were able to box Iran in, and that the technical, very detailed technical deal was actually enough, which is why you had all the tension in the United States and in the region about the deal being so technically focused on a single thing, and that was essentially the breakout time. And on the nuclear issue. So, I don't know that it was necessarily and I understand why the Obama administration pursued it the way it did, but I don't know that it was necessarily effective in that it kind of paved the way for what became the US withdrawal from the JCPOA under Trump. And it did create a lot of tensions regionally with the Saudis especially, but also the Emiratis to a lesser degree, that I think were not particularly helpful from either the JCPOA perspective or broader regional security perspective. But I do agree with you that it is going to be even more difficult boxing that issue in now or in 2021. The region has moved tremendously since 2015, right? When the JCPOA was concluded, the Yemen war wasn't where it is today. The Iran-Saudi relationship was nowhere as bad as it is today. You didn't have the Gulf split. You did not have the Russians really yet involved in the Syrian war. It was just the beginning of their involvement in the Syrian war. So the fate of the Syrian conflict looked very different from where it is today. And lastly, you didn't have all of the push and pull of the past few years under the Trump administration with the withdrawal, not withdrawal, and again, withdrawal from Syria, the negotiations around the withdrawal in Afghanistan. All those things had not yet happened. And so, I think we're looking at a much more complicated regional landscape today. And it's going to be a lot more complicated siloing that and kind of taking on a JCPOA type approach without actually tackling the regional issues either exactly at the same time or kind of with the understanding that that would be next and that there would have to be progress on the regional front. So that is actually what makes back to Afshan's point about whether or not Biden would be able to return to the JCPOA as it was written in 2015. That makes it a bit more challenging because the agreement is 150 something pages, but it has nothing on any of those issues, and regional partners and in the United States, if you want to have some sort of bipartisan support for it, and I think even including among Democrats, you would have to tackle the regional issue before you're able to kind of return to kind of go back to a 2015, 2016 type of engagement with Iran.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I'm just gonna sort of add some other things that all just sort of echo in some way what Ariane just said. I think the problem with the nuclear deal is that it sort of solved a symptom, but it didn't solve sort of the root cause of U.S.-Iran tensions, right? It was kind of like putting a salve on a rash, and maybe the rash, it no longer itches for a while, but whatever sort of systemic problem that's causing it is still there, right? And those causes are much broader regionally. I mean, they focus on Israel, but they also focus on the groups that are at war with Israel. They focus on, Iran's involvement in Iraq to a certain extent. Yemen, I think, is a slightly different issue, but certainly for the Saudis, it's front and center. And then Lebanon is obviously a big deal. If I can step back for a second and sort of use an analogy in terms of how the region, for the most part, sees Iran. Iranians don't like this because we all think that we're, everybody loves us. But the region often looks at Iran is like a really bad neighbor, right? A bad neighbor that throws wild parties at night, parks 5-6 cars in its front lawn, plays loud music at all times of the day. And what they want to be able to do is call the police on Iran to get Iran to sort of, stop doing what it's doing. The nuclear program, had it become a nuclear weapon, was kind of like giving that neighbor diplomatic immunity, right? So that they could never, really be taken to task, never really be forced to change their behavior. That was the fear, is that the nuclear weapon would give an umbrella to everything else that bothered them about Iran. So it wasn't the problem, it just exacerbated the problem, and almost, had it ever been achieved, would have made the problem almost kind of unaddressable for the countries within the region. That's obviously why, also, the nuclear issues sort of resonated with people, right? The mushroom cloud, all that kind of stuff. It politically resonated. So it was easy for the Bush administration, later the Obama administration, to sort of use that to build up leverage, with sanctions and stuff with Iran. But the problem is, I think, is that the Obama administration saw the nuclear issue not as an Iran or a counter-proliferation issue. This was their chance to sort of make sure that Iran wouldn't go nuclear, and that you wouldn't have sort of other countries sort of following suit. That's totally reasonable. I think it was a reasonable agreement, on those metrics. It had a lot going for it, and certainly I think sort of solved the problem, at least for a decade or 15 years. But it never would have solved America's problems with Iran, and it wouldn't have solved the region's problems with Iran. And that's why we were always going to get back to essentially where we are now. Things might be less different if, if let's say, we had a different administration, it would be articulated differently. It may not be as hostile. It may not be as sort of, razor edge in terms of the potential for conflict, but those tensions would still be there, and it would still be very difficult to get around. I think, the one thing that the Trump administration has been able to do is articulate, in their own way, kind of that list of problems that the U.S. has with Iran. I mean, we often kind of laugh at Pompeo's sort of 12-point list because it's just so maximalist, right? And everybody was just like, there's no way Iran's ever going to go for this. This is a non-starter. This is DOA. They're just going to dismiss this out of hand. But the one thing that he did was kind of articulate, I think, for the first time, sort of the laundry list, and it could be reduced to fewer than 12. I think, 3 or 4 issues are really the most important. But he articulated, I think, for the first time, the real sort of crux of the issue for Iran and for U.S. allies within the region. So that being said, I think whatever the next administration is, whether it's the Trump administration that doesn't have to worry about being reelected for a third time, or a Biden administration, I think either one is going to be working in some respect from that list. Or as Ariane said, it would be very difficult, I think, to just treat the nuclear issue separately anymore. You have to look at ballistic missiles now. You have to look at Yemen. You have to look at Syria. You have to look at Lebanon. You have to look at Iraq, all in different ways, but they're all important, right? And if Iran's sort of ballistic missile attack against Ain al-Assad, I think achieved anything, it was that Iran, any sort of future U.S.-Iran, deal is going to have to deal with that, right? Because Iran really showcased that capability as dangerous, as accurate, and as something, frankly, I think more concerning than their nuclear program, at least in the time being. So it's going to be really hard to get around and just kind of go back to the days of 2015 where you could treat it as a non-proliferation issue. I think it's more of a strategic and security issue. And I would think it would behoove both Iran and the United States and Europe and everybody else to treat it as such if there was another round of talks. So I'll leave it there.
Alex, I know that you're on deadline. I think you got something. So if you want to give your final shot, thoughts here.
I will be very short to just to gain time. Of course, I totally agree with Ashen and with Iran. Of course, regarding Russia, I already told that Putin likes both ways. Yes, whatever happens with Iran, with Iranian nuclear program, now in the future, etc., it distracts the world's attention from his own actions. Yes, I don't know how for last 10 years Moscow supported or not this program. I mean nuclear program. Yes, I have a lot of rumors, but I have no proofs. Yes, we try to investigate something ourselves, but any turbulence for Putin in the so-called big Middle East is some credit, some gains. Yes, and if he does, he makes everything possible to keep it on this way. In the future, I think nothing will change. I have several questions I see regarding also Russia. Yes, in our chat. Yes, first from Muhammad Tahir. What are the chances of Russia-Iran alliance in Afghanistan and post-United States withdrawal? Any sign that such alliances are already in the making? No, I think this possibility is very, very low. Maybe they will try to divide somehow the zones of influence in Afghanistan, but some kind of course of military friendship in Afghanistan, I estimate it as on a very, very low level. Other question from Paul Sparks. What type of support would Russia provide? Financial, military, mercenaries, etc. What do you mean? Support where? To Iran directly or in Syria? Or...
Yeah, I mean, just because we're coming close to the end here, why don't we just, I mean, I think you answered that, and then maybe I'll come to each one of the panelists now to give some final thoughts. You know, you have maybe a minute or two. You know, I mean, I guess just the final question, and just to wrap up here is, you know, if I agree, I think I agree with everybody, is that we're kind of we've hit the pause button until the election. You know, particularly for the balancing of Iranian foreign policy. You know, what should we expect out of Iran? You know, I mean, should we expect, you know, fireworks like we saw maybe last year, or are they going to wait around, perhaps continue these low-level attacks in Iraq, excuse me, until they get a good sense of where American foreign policy will go? And do you think if it is a Trump administration, they may try and, you know, appeal to his you know, sometimes willingness to you know, do rapid foreign policy changes and engage in negotiations, if he thinks it will be beneficial to his domestic political standing? About 1 minute each. I know that's a big question.
Well, so, you know, we often say that Iran gets a vote in whatever happens in the U.S.-Iran relationship, but here, you know, I think it's important to highlight that both the U.S. and Israel get a vote as well. You may have seen the reporting from the New York Times last week about these recent, very mysterious explosions that seem to happen pretty much every night or every other night in Iran right now. Some that have hit Iranian nuclear military facilities, and others that seem to be completely random on civilian targets, on civilian facilities. So, you know, I think that the question here is, Iran may very well want to kind of not rock the boat until November and potentially even January if Trump loses, right? But can it actually do that if there is indeed a kind of a coherent, coordinated campaign going on between the US and Israel? And especially if Trump loses and Israel realizes that actually, you know, it's going to lose its ally in the White House, Democrats being a bit more skeptical following the incidents of 2015 between the U.S. and Israel regarding the JCPOA, Iran may have to actually do something and may not be able to sit on its hands anymore. And so it's really, really hard to predict what's going to happen in my view. But I do think that the general sort of consensus right now within the system is, let's wait and see what happens next. Whether or not they can do that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they have every political reason, I think, to wait just a few more months. We haven't mentioned, you know, sort of the pandemic that all countries are dealing with right now. I think that's, you know, how that shapes behavior or actions is anybody's guess. And where that is, frankly, in 2 months or 3 months or 5 months or whatever, we still don't know. I think that has, you know, that's an X factor that you can't really count on. What was I going to say? You know, I think Iran's sort of, you know, willingness to use sort of military pressure to make a point has increased. You know, I think Iran feels like they have a lot less to lose than they did before because they realize that the United States really doesn't want to go to war with Iran, and so they can push the envelope, and they've been pushing the envelope, I think, quite a lot in a lot of ways. Awesome. Qasem Soleimani is no longer with us because of that. But other than that, you know, Iran has mostly sort of fared that storm and gotten away with quite a bit. I think what we often sort of, you know, I don't want to say fail to recognize, but we don't really talk about it, is that, you know, while Iran has some really savvy politicians and diplomats that understand the United States well, understand the United States electoral politics and everything else pretty well, the supreme leader doesn't, you know, as far as we can tell, you know, and I think, you know, he sees sort of, you know, the U.S. more, I think, in sort of broad terms. And I think for him, if you can take his, you know, statements with any value, you know, the Trump administration really has, you know, been the most authentic American administration that he's ever dealt with, right? The Trump administration, I think, for them is like pure id, right? It is like the pure essence of U.S. sort of foreign policy and behavior. And so I don't think the Trump administration is really seen as like an aberration for them or really a disconnect from the status quo. I think for them, it's always been the status quo. This is always what the United States has been. They just speak sort of in nicer words or in softer tones. But ultimately, they all sort of want the same thing, or will do the same thing as the Trump administration. And so in that sense, I think at least for the short term, sort of U.S.-Iran relations are kind of DOA. I don't think that there's going to be much improvement, diplomatically, like we saw in the JCPOA for a while, without trying to extract, I think, real concessions from the United States. I think, unless Iran gets really desperate, we don't know what their checkbook looks like. They could be, broke as a joke and just waiting to this far from sort of, capitulating. But I don't get that sense. I feel that they can kind of withstand pressure for a long time. So I suspect we're going to have more of the same. I don't think it's going to change all that much. If anything, if we have a change in administration, you might see a slightly more aggressive or assertive Iran trying to sort of, put out a more maximalist agenda of their own in dealing with the new administration. If the Trump administration is reelected, I think it'll be more challenging for them to do that. But, we'll see.
Alexander, final words?
Yes, about Russian-Iranian relationship in the close future, I think Moscow and Tehran will begin to divide zones of influence in Syria, and they could collide with each other. The possibility of this is not 100%, but it's great, and we will see in very soon time.
Well, thank you for keeping it brief. We are 1 minute over our time, and as I promised, we will end on time. I'll give ourselves a 1 minute window. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for the three panelists, and thank you, everybody, for the questions. They were great. Sorry we couldn't get to every single one of them. If you enjoyed the lecture, that means you will enjoy FPRI. Head on over to fpri.org, check out the website, and consider becoming a member. So with that, good evening, Alexander. Good morning, Afshan. Good afternoon, Ariane. And good.
I have 6 p.m.
6 p.m. for you. I guess it's happy hour for you. And good luck for everybody, depending on where you are in the world dialing in. So have a good rest of the day.